Hi everyone, Magnus here, and today I'm covering the absolutely phenomenal performance that just got put out by Magnus Carlsen in the late title Tuesday. As you can probably tell from the title, 11 out of 11, devastating score. I think Magnus now becomes the only person to have two 11 out of 11 scores, um, with himself and Hikaru obviously holding 11 out of 11 one time each previously. Now, coming in with round number 5, I'm just going to be showing this game fairly briefly, um, but at the same time, the games I have got lined up for you are some special ones. I've got this great game that he played against Andreikin. We've got Sam Shankland in the first game. Of course, the long-awaited Hikaru Magnus. Everyone loves this. And this game was also pretty nice. And finally, we have Magnus versus Jeffrey Xiong for the 11 out of 11 perfection. So, starting with Shankland, Magnus goes for e4, we get Sicilian, and he goes for bishop c4, which is pretty non-standard when in the Sicilian because you can put a pawn on e6, but Magnus doesn't really care. He plays all these weird uh, non-standard Sicilians, and after e6 he goes for d4, and he takes with the queen. This is typical Magnus behavior. Getting this kind of weird Magnus Carlsen Sicilian. I think people are familiar with the one where you take with the queen, but generally that's when you can move the bishop out to pin the knight. And also in situations where you're playing this b3, bishop b2 long castles, which doesn't exactly happen. Instead we get, so we get queen d3, and the bishop would normally go to b3, but instead we just get bishop to f4. Magnus developing like he is playing e4, e5, and has really just not paid any attention to the opponent's moves, which of course he has. Queen to c7 gets played long castles. Magnus now putting considerable pressure on this d6 pawn here. E5 played, Magnus moves the bishop to g5, now pressuring the horse and looking to potentially put a big pony in the center. The knight comes out to b5, harassing the queen. Queen goes to e2, you've got to keep control of the bishop, and bishop to e6 played. Magnus plays his knight to d2, guarding the bishop, and potentially looking to kick, take this guy maybe, and try and put some pressure on this d6 pawn. We get the rook, captures, and knight takes on a2. So I do think Shankland might have been expecting bishop to b3 rather than bishop takes e6, and that's why he played knight takes on a2 in 1 second. Either that or he just forgot that Magnus's bishop moves backwards. And this might be a case of the Magnus effect, not really sure. I haven't asked Sam Shankland, but you can imagine how he felt when the Magnus simply moved back with his bishop that just captured a piece and takes the knight on a2, and a very quick win in round number 5 for Magnus, putting him at 6 out of 6 as we enter the second half of the event. Now, moving on to the next game, he's playing Andreikin. I believe this is round number 8 or 9, and Magnus has the black pieces, and he goes for knight to f6 and b5. b5 is a very enterprising move, and the point of b5, let's just flip to Magnus's side for a second. The point of b5 is that you want to get your bishop out here and also throw this b pawn down the board, as well as prevent this move pawn to c4 from getting played in a traditional Catalan setup. So Magnus goes for a6, and as you can see, he's already got his expansion going on the queen side. e6 played, because now if you were to take this guy, we would potentially get a capture here. I'm not exactly sure how this would work. Probably something like this, and you would just argue that this structure is a little bit better and black is doing fine. Instead we get b3, bishop b2, these moves getting played pretty fast. It seems like both players know what they're doing. Actually, Magnus is down a bunch on the clock, so I guess Andreikin is playing fast and just trying to keep the momentum. Magnus starts pushing his a pawn down the board, looking to get a trade here. This position for black looks pretty solid. You've got the big pawn center potentially, and a majority that can be pushed down the board. a4, Magnus just no respect, just like he did in that team chess game, which you might have seen where he just threw an a-pawn down the board and sacrificed it for nothing. Magnus is loving these flank pawn pushes. So he gets a capture. Bishop to c6 played, getting the bishop out of harm's way, and maybe looking for some knight to a6 moves as well. Not really sure. Oh yeah, bishop comes out to a4, kicking the queen. Potentially queen to c3 can be met with something like c5, and a horse comes into the middle. Knight to c6, horse is jumping in, and Magnus is going to try and play for d5 at some point, but really black is just saying I have more pawns in the middle and you've got this kind of weak a pawn over here, and therefore black should be a little bit better. Knight jumps into the center. Magnus plays knight to b5. Knight b4. He is not interested, and instead he says, I want to start launching these pawns, and I'm going to smash you down the middle of the board. And queen d2, obviously Andreikin saying, I'm not too interested in getting smashed right now. And instead, Magnus just snacks on the a2 pawn. And now he's a pawn up. He's got these nice center pawns at any point that can boot the ponies out of the middle. So something like d6, d5, all of a sudden your horses are all discombobulated. The rook goes to a1, harassing the Magnus's pony. But Magnus's pony does have a way out, knight to b4, which he swiftly uses. Pawn to f4. Andreikin goes on the offensive here, but bishop to b5, captures. G4 really going on the offensive with this big pawn wall, but Magnus starts chopping down the forest here. Bishop to c4, knight takes, and he grabs the g pawn, which, by the way, was previously not accessible because of the knight, but if you were to take like this, it's even worse as everything starts falling apart. You got to here move the king, and all of a sudden, like your center is collapsing. Apparently there's a better move, d6, and on knight to f3, then you can either take this guy or that guy. But either way, Magnus is now grabbed 2 pawns, and after the move queen to a7, a sneaky little check, Magnus sniping from the side of the board. There are all kinds of knight to f2 threats that are now a thing. And by the way, after king to h1, there's actually the stunning move, knight takes on d3, beautiful stuff. And if you take with the queen, there is knight to f2, takes and takes. Magnus probably didn't go for this. I imagine he probably saw this, but he thought now there's 2 pieces for the rook. That's generally not a very good trade. But after something like bishop d4, queen e1, let's say queen f1, this endgame is actually great for black. With something like here, maybe even c5, and you can kick the bishop back, and then all of a sudden these pawns are marching down the board, and you have a very good game. But anyway, Magnus goes d5, which is given the double question mark, rather unfairly, I think. I think this move seems great. And after queen to f4, I mean, things are already getting difficult, both players low on time. There is knight to f2 check once again, with these knight d3 ideas. So something like knight to f2 takes, takes, and knight d3. Point being that after your rook moves somewhere, you will take this rook first, and this knight first, and then the bishop is weak here, and your passed c-pawn will win you the game. Magnus decides it's best to go for h5, and say that your knight's still hanging, this pawn's still hanging, f2's still a problem, and your position is terrible, and he is correct. We get a capture on d5, knight takes on d3, hitting the queen, hitting f2, and at this point, queen to f3, and you guys already know the puzzle rush tactic that Magnus goes for. He goes for knight fd2, and Andreikin, good sport, allows the kill after knight to h3, king g1, and pause for it, queen g1. Everyone's favorite, brilliant move, queen g1, sacrificing the queen in the corner for the double knight smothered mate. Oh baby, that is the good stuff. Anyway, Magnus now moving on with, I believe, 8 out of 8 for a match against Hikaru Nakamura. Let's see how this one goes. Magnus opens knight to f3, Hikaru d5, b3, c5, e3. Magnus going for this kind of modern caged setup. He's going to develop bishop to b5, probably get his bishop out b2, and he's going to try and play against the pawns that Hikaru is putting in the center. Now, this is something that Hikaru does a lot in his own games. He loves to play these e3, b3 setups, and Magnus, I guess, taking it to Hikaru a little bit with his own system. Knight c6, bishop to b5, pinning the horse, and Hikaru goes f6, trying to build his patented big black center. Knight to c3 gets played. Magnus putting some pressure on the middle, potentially something like here, and trying to break apart that center. So we get captures, bishop to a3, bishop comes out, stops Magnus castling, and knight to a4. Magnus chipping away at this c5 pawn, a little bit like he's playing a Nimzo Indian, except he's playing the white pieces. Queen comes out to a5, stopping Magnus from capturing for the time being with some pressure down the a-file. And Magnus plays c4, which is a cutting pawn sacrifice. The idea being that if you want to take here, he's now going to go queen c2, and if you keep gobbling, he'll just take back, and all of a sudden it's actually you who's getting skewered by the rook. So something like queen c2, and let's say you were to take, you can simply take back, and all of a sudden you're the one in pressure. I'm no longer in danger. Magnus becomes the danger, and he skewers he skewers the queen to the bish. Of course, that did not happen. Hickey was not falling for any of that nonsense, and instead he plays bishop to b5, trying to put some pressure down this line. Magnus plays queen to c3, offering this queen trade. Hikaru says, no queen trade for you. I guess he probably looked at this position, wasn't too interested in having the Irish c-pawns or the triple Carl. And he probably just rejected this and says, no, I'm going to keep the queens on, buddy. Play queen a6. But Magnus now grabs bishop c5, and he's got the better structure. Hikaru's kind of got his like light squared web X of pawns. We get captures, bishop captures, massive liquidation here. Hickey chooses not to take the a4 pawn. I can definitely understand that. Maybe he was concerned about just simple stacking up or castles and bringing a rook to the middle. Engine's saying that king e2 is the best move. Just bring your rook over, and all of a sudden the c pawns just drop off the board, and white is much better. So there's actually a very interesting opening by Magnus showing these hypermodern systems and playing against weak c-pawns. Rook goes to the c-file, Magnus now captures, and basically white argues that these two pawns here are much weaker and much worse than this one pawn island and then this huge boat of pawns on the king side. Two center pawns for white and an isolated two pawns for black. And white is in fact quite a bit better. After king goes to f7, both players, Hikaru is kind of doing the Fred Boncloud, the classic f6, king f7. Magnus with the tried and tested actual Boncloud. Definitely very respectable there. And now he's going to bring the rooks out. The rook's going to go to a4 maybe, put some pressure on this a7 pawn. Rook goes to b8. Magnus brings his other rook into the party. Rook goes to pressure the b pawn. Rook to a4, defending and attacking. Beautiful dual purpose move here. King up to e6. Hikaru centralizes. Knight goes to e1. Magnus looking to reposition his pony potentially to c5 and then to e4. Maybe he'll reinforce it with g4 in the future, and he'll just kind of start expanding his position and putting some pressure on Hikaru. So that's exactly what we get. A3 played. A3 is a very funky move. I'm actually not exact. I guess, okay, so rook b4 would have been a problem, hitting the knight and hitting the rook. And if you can get an exchange here, then the a2 pawn is weak and black would actually be in the driver's seat. So really, really careful move here by Magnus. Pawn to a3, very nice, stopping the rook going to b4. Rook comes to the d-file, and of course g4, creating the bastion knight, as Hikaru would say, and locking down the black counterplay. King goes to b6, rook c4. We get a little bit of shuffling about. Hikaru's low on time. Magnus also down to 40 seconds. H4, G6. And Magnus starts sending the pawns down the board. I can respect f4. I don't really know why the engine's saying it's bad. Apparently you're meant to take, and after knight takes, you're just meant to like suffer this position, which ultimately looks quite unpleasant. Engine's giving some kind of concrete solution, but still, this position looks horrible. In the long run, I don't see black doing very well here. So f4, definitely a good move. Knight d5. Hikaru going after this pawn, but after the simple captures, knight back to c5. Magnus has decided the knight's done its job on e6, let's return it home. Actually, it's returning home to d3 to put pressure on this pawn here, which is definitely nice. And a4, Magnus now starts the procedure of the rook canal surgery. He's trying to tear that rook out of his mouth, and he is not interested. He's going to kick that rook to d5 and hit it with e4, which he does. And apparently after rook to d4, somehow this position's okay. Doesn't make any sense to me how exactly the engine thinks that black is holding here. But apparently black is. At least it would be better than rook to d6, which does simply hang the e5 pawn. This g pawn, this g juicer, the Gary pawn is now defended by the horse, and the other horse is unable to take it. Rook to e6, g5, nice little Zwischenzug by Magnus, saying if you want to take me, I'm going to take you. And instead, we simply get the knight moving, and pawn to d4. Magnus solidifies his centralized pony, and after the rook moves up, Magnus centralizes the king, creates the huddle formation here, and simply captures a pawn after it loses the defender. Magnus moves back, targeting the pawn here. Hikaru throws in the towel, seeing Dave and Eddie ready to run down the red carpet in the middle. So definitely a pretty impressive game by Magnus, crossing well over 3,300 blitz at this point, by the way, which is just crazy. And yeah, I guess Hikaru just had a slightly off game. Finally, we have the 11 out of 11 game, the Piece de Resistance, and it was a very exciting game. Magnus versus Chef Jeff himself, Xiong, and we have knight to f3, Magnus going for another weird setup. Jeffrey stealing Magnus's pawn to b5 move from earlier on in this video, and playing a6. We get bishop g2, castles b3, Magnus going for the double fianchetto, developing his horse, and we get pushing on the queen side here. Magnus puts some pressure on this pawn, saying I'm going to play d5, and let's see how the game goes. Magnus clamps down in the center completely. Jeffrey says, let's start trading some pieces. Magnus says, sure, why not? And I'm going to keep pressing in the center. Just look at this expansion over here. Magnus does love his space. Pawn to e5, though, saying, you're not going to push me over. But Magnus says, did you read about en passant? There it is. And he takes on e6. If he didn't take on e6, position would most likely just be completely locked, and there wouldn't be a whole lot to do. Like, let's say this happens. All of a sudden, we got f6, g5, h6, and black creates the dark squared blockade, and there's sometimes no way to break through. So Magnus, of course, wanting to win, get that 11 out of 11, he captures. And then actually plays this really nice move, pawn to e5, disrupting the black coordination. He's now got a knight pressuring c5. He's about to smash this position, get the double eddies in the middle. He's going to trade off the bishops, bring the rook, and it's just going to be a nice endgame, smooth, better position for white. Instead of going for that position with taking, he pushes the pawn. Jeffrey does, and Magnus can now simply start playing some moves to improve the position, and it's going to be a little bit unpleasant because you don't ever want to push, because then you're going to have this forever weakness on c5 holding everything together. So Magnus just starts improving the position. Jeffrey captures. Magnus then plays this nice in between move, knight g5, going for the big time family fork on e6. Oh wait, actually, I didn't even realize that doesn't hang a knight, because now this knight is actually loose. The queen was overworked, so it's an even better move than I thought. He captures here rook f7 and he takes on e6. So Magnus done his tactics today. It's clearly on fantastic form. Bishop takes and c3. Magnus can now play moves like f4, kick the queen, make connect 4, win the game, as well as take this pawn here. And once this c pawn falls and the b pawn falls, the c3 pawn falls, and with it the position falls. The knight takes on c5. Queen comes back to c4. Magnus now looking to collect and collect. He's knocking on the door. Jeffrey hasn't paid his rent, and Jeffrey does take this e5 pawn, but now the b4 pawn and the c3 pawn is collapsing. The knight does come in with an attack and a protect, but queen c4, Magnus simply gets out of danger, and with the rook coming to the e file, kicking the queen, it is pretty loosely defended, defending the knight, and queens are some of the worst defenders. So after the rook moves here, we do in fact get a tactic. If the queen were to move to f5, there would be, I guess, knight e6 check, and you would get forked. But instead, Jeffrey does come up with a very interesting tactic. Rook takes f2, which looks like it might even win the game. But after rook takes, if you were to take with the rook, then the king would take and get over to defend the white rook. And if you take the rook on e1 like he did in the game, there is this nice move, queen to d4, the only move, by the way, defending this rook, hitting the king, pressuring the knight, and possibly looking to regroup with knight to e4. We get king to h6. Magnus repeats the position one time, just to gain a little bit more time on his clock and potentially ask Jeffrey what he's doing and why he's got 5 seconds left. But actually, it's important because if king to h6 would work if it wasn't for rook takes f8, which is just a great move. And after this move, queen to d2, it looks like potentially you're in trouble because if you have to take here, all of a sudden the pawn has snuck through, and you might even have to play this sketchy endgame with something like here, king e2, and takes, and all of a sudden it's a mad race. But simply the queen returns to f2, protecting the king and preventing the c pawn from moving, because then the queen would be captured on d2. We get knight to e3 check, one last ditch attempt, but a bold king walk by Magnus out to f3 saying, I'm not scared of queen e4, my king is just going to waltz over into the position, you're going to get checkmated probably by moves like queen to f4. And so after king to f3, Jeffrey decided to throw in the towel and hand over that prestigious 11 out of 11 to Magnus Carlsen. Now, that is the end of this recap. If you guys did enjoy the video, please do consider liking and subscribing. That would be very much appreciated. And otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.